Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Future Trends Forum. My name is Brian Alexander. I'm your host and cat herder for this week, and we have a really great guest and a lot to cover. But first, if you could just tell me in the chat box, can you all hear me okay? Just quickly say yes if you can. And if you say no, I'll be really curious about how you knew that. Oh, good. Excellent. My apologies for the delay. My nice laptop decided to have some spectacular browser problems that required multiple browser relaunches and a whole bunch of setting rejiggering. I'm sure most of you know how that can go. Well, welcome. My apologies for starting late, but let's dig in. So before we go into this week's guest, let's talk about the forum, where it came from, how it's supported, and how it works. So Tara, if you go to the next slide, please. So you should know that the Future Trends Forum is a video discussion spin-off of the Future Trends in Technology and Education report. Now, that's a monthly trends analysis that tracks about 86 trends and has done so for almost 6 years now across the whole spectrum of education and technology. If you haven't seen it already, go to ftte.us and you can download some sample issues and learn more. Next slide, please. Now, the forum and the FTTE report are part of a broader project called the Future of Education Observatory. And this is a kind of continuous, multimedia, participatory exploration of the future of education. And so we run this forum every week. We have the Future Trends in Technology and Education report every month. We have a regular blog, which has some pretty active listening. We have participation. We have a book club. We have a bookstore and more to come. So if you'd like to think more about the future of education, or if you're curious about the site, just go to futureofeducation.us and you can learn more. Next slide, please. Now, before we go into this week's guest, I'd like to talk about how the forum is supported. And so to begin with, I'd like to thank one of our great generous sponsors. So let me thank NYSERNet from New York State. This is a nonprofit that works to get that state's colleges and universities on broadband internet. They do some tremendous work, and we're really grateful to them for their generous support. We're also grateful to Shindig, because as you can tell, Shindig makes available this technology we're using. So let me just walk you through it so you can see how to use it, if you're new to it, if you haven't used it for a while. To begin with, where I am, and where this slide is just for a minute, this is called the stage, and everybody can see and hear everything that goes on the stage. Now below us is what I think of as the participant swarm, where you can see a whole bunch of different people. You can see Nancy Weiner, you can see Doyle, you can see a bunch of different people. And you'll see that they'll move around back and forth as we proceed. Now, how can you interact? I said this is conversation-based, right? There are 3 ways you can interact with people. Now, first, look down at the bottom of the screen. You'll see a white strip running along, and that has a series of tools. On the far left edge, you'll see what looks an icon that has a number. I think it's 64 right now. It's got some people on it and a kind of cartoon dialog box. If you click that, 2 windows will pop up. Bottom left, you'll see a kind of film strip view of everybody who's here right now. So if you mouse over Frederick Bessiers, you can see him smiling at you. If you mouse over Michael Stewart, you can't see him, but you can still find him right there. And you can see, basically get a nice sense of everyone who's participating. And if you want to talk to one of them privately, just double click on them. If they feel like talking to you, your 2 icons can click together. You have your own private audiovisual conversation. Now, to the right of that is the chat box, and that's the chat box for the entire room. And you can see everybody here who's been talking. So you can see people introducing themselves. And speaking of which, if you haven't already introduced yourself, take a minute to do it in the chat box. Just say who you are and where you're from. And Nancy, thank you. It's Nancy Weiner. I really appreciate that. My German is very poor. So I'll just type in, I'm Brian in the Washington, D.C. area. We'll be monitoring that chat box throughout the conversation. Now, go back to that white strip for a second. Next to the participant and chat box icon is another icon with a circle with a question mark in it. If you click that, you can type in a question or a comment that we can then display for the crowd. The way that works is we'll flash it on the screen so everyone can read it, and I'll read it out loud so everyone can hear it. Now, back in that white strip, next to the circle with a question mark is a hand icon. Now, if you click that hand, this is the best thing. This will tell us that you want to join us on stage. So if your camera is working and your mic is on, click that, and we'll bring you up on stage when the time is right. In fact, we can have 4 different people up here at once. So you can have myself, you, our guest, and another person for a kind of panel discussion. So those are 3 ways built into the technology that let you converse, share, talk, hobnob, push back, and ask questions. And that's what we do here. We're all about the discussion. And we're really grateful to Shindig for giving us access to this technology. Now, we're also grateful to another group, which is all of our supporters on Patreon. Now, if you haven't seen Patreon, it's a crowdfunding site like Kickstarter or GoFundMe. And the idea is that you can support someone making something creative. In this case, it's our project to create media and projects, research, and conversations about the future of education. So if you go to www.patreon.com/Brian Alexander, you can see all kinds of information about it. If you look in the left edge of the screen, the very bottom left edge of the screen, you'll see there are a few different widgets, a kind of tan color. And I think the middle one will take you right to the Patreon. And you can see people who contribute as little as $1 a month just to keep the lights on, the technology humming, and everything organized. You can see from the slide that we have great people: Jeannie Kim Han, Chris Lott, Kyle Johnson, Rob Johnson, Paul McConaughey, all kinds of people who contribute. We're really grateful to them for their support. And you should join them if you haven't already. Now, on to the next slide. I'm really excited to have Kelly Walsh here. Kelly is a man who I've known for some years. He's the Chief Information Officer right now at the College of Westchester. He does a lot there, including teaching a bit. And what he specializes in, for me in many ways, is not just the CIO perspective, which is great, but he's also really, really focused on blended learning. He's been studying this, researching it, and supporting it for years. He's produced an awful lot of material about it. So since blended learning is a major, major theme for technology and education, and since Kelly is an awesome fellow, I wanted to invite him on. So let's bring Kelly up on stage, and we'll start talking and thinking about blended learning and the future of education. Kelly, greetings.
Hi, Brian and everyone. How are you doing? Can you hear me okay?
Perfectly, perfectly. Where are you today?
Excellent. I'm in my office, and there's this tendency for the view outside the windows to look gorgeous and tropical, and it's not. It's an optical illusion of the covering on the windows. But hey, it looks great. It's even cheerful to me to look at in the in the reflection.
Well, that's good to see you. But you're in upstate New York, right?
Close to downstate in White Plains, just north of the city.
Excellent. Well, tell us in your own words, what is it you do, Kelly? What do you work on?
It was interesting to hear you, refer to my work as a look at blended learning, because it wasn't something that was necessarily at the top of my thinking all the time, but on reflection, it certainly is. So when I came to the school about a decade ago, I was very interested in the evolving relationship between technology and education, and I started to really focus on that, and I soon started to blog, which was also a great opportunity. 10 years ago, that was becoming a very meaningful thing. And I just got deeper and deeper into it, and have always been looking at, how can technology play a meaningful role in teaching and learning? And certainly blended learning and my sort of a more focused specialization in that niche of flip learning are things that absolutely have had an impact and continue to evolve and have a meaningful impact. And then, much like yourself, I also get into a lot of other things related to the relationship between education and technology.
Wow, excellent. That tells us a lot. I just can't believe you've been there for 10 years. Time flies.
Yeah, time flies.
Excellent. Well, let's talk about blended learning, and please bring in your CIO, wear your CIO hat as you can, because that's a very, very vital perspective for us. So tell us, first of all, in 2018, what does blended learning mean for you? How do you define it?
Well, at the simplest sense, blended is sort of, and in fact, in the resource page that I created, I made a quick little Venn diagram at the top, right, and said, all right, here's traditional, here's online, and where these two intersect in many ways is blended learning. So, bringing in digital learning resources and techniques into the traditional classroom, but then also, very importantly, and I think a lot of times in the blended world, people don't think of this right away, but bringing traditional elements into the online classroom, which I think is almost more important these days because of that platform and how much it's growing, but at the same time it lacks that social face-to-face aspect that can make education so rich.
Yes, well, that's nicely said. And friends, before we go further with my interrogation of poor Kelly, Please, this is from here on out. This is where we're driven by your questions, your concerns, your comments, your thoughts. So, just right now, we just start with the definition of blended learning, what it means. So, think about your experience of it. Have you been teaching that way? Have you been learning that way? Are you supporting someone that way? So, on a very practical level, but also think about the different issues and topics that Kelly and I are going to bring up. So, let me ask to if I could, why did blended learning just take off so quickly? Why did it just grow so fast and become so uncontroversially successful?
Well, I think the real trick was about the availability of technology. Once
Mm,
the internet became so popular, and we all have these devices in our hands, it's like with Flipped in particular. I've always looked back at how interesting it was that around 2007, 2008, it kind of organically sprang up in many areas. And I think that was largely because teachers started to say, hey, there's this thing called YouTube, and there's these web pages,
mhm.
and there's so many ways now for me to put my content online. And it opens up this sort of paradigm shift to be able to say, hey, I don't need to be all about content delivery. I can put that content in a place where it can be rewound and replayed. And now I can fundamentally change and free up time in the classroom for me to use differently. So it was certainly the digital technologies and the popularity of the internet and these so many devices that we now use to access that content and create content that I think has driven this logical move towards blended.
Especially YouTube, that seems to have played a major role in your history of this.
Yeah, absolutely. It was very, a lot of blended is video based, but it's important to realize it doesn't have to be. And there are so many fun, creative platforms to create content that can be interactive.
Mm.
But video is a straightforward and easy one, and YouTube makes it easy to deliver.
It really does. And then we have all these new tools like One Button Studio for making video. And of course, the cell phones have made things even easier and easier to do and make.
Absolutely.
Um, so that explains a lot. And the studies so far show that blended learning tends to produce better results than either face-to-face learning alone or online learning by itself, right?
Yeah, there have been quite a few, particularly the meta-analysis are interesting, right? Where these studies look at groups of studies and try and cull from them the findings. And there tends to be a pretty common finding that blended is just a little better than just online or just face-to-face. I actually put several of those studies in the resources link page. So if people want to go and explore them.
And just before you say that, or before you say more about that, everyone, there's another widget on the bottom left of the screen. I think it's the top one. So click there to pop up one of Kelly's resource pages because you're quite prolific online. There's so many things to look at. So this is
A lot of
fascinating.
fun
I mean,
topics.
well, we've reached the time where we have the technology necessary for this practice to emerge and for it to work. And then we have some of the research necessary that shows us that this is a positive pedagogical structure. It sounds like a real success story for education technology. Let me ask if I could, as a CIO, I mean, thinking about your entire institution, how do you collectively support blended learning? How do you help faculty do it? What's involved in terms of technology and strategy and funding and professional development? What does it take?
Sure. Well, and I will just throw kind of a caveat in there that um, my thinking extends far beyond my institution for a couple of reasons. So I'm not necessarily reflecting precisely what happens here, but certainly, one thing that has become so normal and common in higher education that supports blended learning is the learning management system. So it has now become pretty much the norm, and I meant to take some time and look for some stats, but my experience is that most higher education institutions have a learning management system, and the level of adoption and use is continually increasing. So faculty is becoming more and more comfortable with it. There are, unfortunately, there's those cases where an instructor may just have a syllabus and a couple other little odds and ends, and it's not really a richly built set of content. But conversely, there are many cases, and certainly in the online environment, it's essential. And online is just one extreme side of blended. But then you have these hybrid scenarios. So we have at the school, for example, an adult college where it is a hybrid program. So there are about 3 hours and 45 minutes of course on a given night, and then the rest of the required course hours are accommodated through a variety of rich learning resources online and assignments. So you really couldn't do that hybrid thing without a platform to deliver on. And K to 12, I think they're if they're not using an LMS yet, which the LMSs aren't as popular, but they're picking up. There's all kinds of alternatives: the wiki, the website, the Edmodo. So many rich tools that allow for the delivery. So that's certainly key, the LMS, and then on top of that, the endless array of evolving tools that you can use to create content, curate content, find content. There's just it's easily overwhelming, right? The number of tools and the amount of information.
How does either your office or other offices on campus, how do you help faculty deal with, on the one hand, trying to winnow out the vast world of content to find the good stuff, and then how do you help them pick the right tool out of such a vast and sprawling toolbox?
We first of all, our primary role is to support and to react to and address their requests when they come to us and say, I need this and I want this. And we couple closely with the folks in our instructional design group to make sure that faculty is constantly learning what they need to about how to use the LMS and other platforms. I enjoy doing training, and there will be times when I will take advantage of opportunities to sit in a faculty professionally development session and talk about some of these tools. We have faculty members who are real champions of some of these tools and will do so themselves. And then I'm always soft pedaling some of the resources I create through emerging ed tech and making them aware of those. And I try not to push too hard in that regard. It's a matter of, hey, I'm very interested. I'd love to have a conversation. Here's these resources and conversations I'm having across the spectrum of K to 16 plus and across the world. And I always invite them to participate in that and ask questions and learn.
It sounds like you're acting as a teacher, as a student, and as a supporter. Friends, in a few minutes, what I'm going to do is ask us to break into small groups and explore blended learning and where it is. And I'm going to give you some questions to think about. But let me just to prepare you for that, let me just walk back through what Kelly said and pull out a few different pieces, because he's talking as the CIO, so he has that role, providing the networks and providing a lot of the staff. Then he pulled out his educational technology groups, educational designers, the sports staff, who then work with faculty. Then alongside them, we have the faculty who help each other, which is a classic step for the promulgation of technology and technologically enabled practices. And then along that, we have him as a kind of quiet change agent, working around by himself personally, making stuff, making it available. So that's a kind of full-scale question. That's a full-scale support strategy. And one thing to think about is, are you experiencing that yourself? Are you seeing that kind of total program? Now, before I go further, we have a question from Barbara Mitchell. So, Tara, if you can flash that on the screen, please. How do you, institutionally, individually, motivate instructors who have traditionally been lecturers? I mean, they value that component of their career, and they get their charge from the stage of the lecture hall. Oh, great question, Barbara.
Yeah, that is absolutely a great question, and a frustrating one to some extent, because there's just no doubt that it's challenging. The other thing too, that because I wear these hats and I'm in this interesting role, I want to be careful to not tell faculty what to do. That's certainly not my role. I want to inspire them to be interested. Hence my sharing of stories about what has worked elsewhere and different tools and how they can work. But unfortunately, our administration, our provost, we have plenty of folks who also encourage them to learn and be aware of what the possibilities are. But to some extent, my running emerging ed tech is sort of an ongoing effort to answer that question, to achieve that goal, to constantly share, not just with my faculty, but all across the world, about things that work in the classroom. I'm actually thinking about a new book focused on student-centered learning and individual success stories because,
Nice.
nothing, it just does such a good job when you can kind of hear, okay, here's somebody's story. I get it. It puts it in perspective. And maybe if you have enough stories, some of them start to touch close to home and
Yes.
inspire you. But that's, Barbara, it's a great question and it's a real challenge.
Well, just let me second that last point there. That the stories are powerful. People, I mean, stats can only go so far, theory can only go so far, but stories of people using anything are very effective. And Barbara, what a fantastic question. Yeah, thank you very much. So if you're new to the forum, you can see how this goes. Wendy, let me run your question by if I could. Uh, Wendy Pranter asked a question this week on the LinkedIn group, I believe, and she asked if you could share your thoughts about blended learning as a gateway to fully online for faculty.
Sure. It's a natural gateway, right? Because if you're going fully online, you need to become adept at and comfortable with the tools, and more importantly, probably the techniques, right? How do we make online learning engaging? And
Mm.
when you start to blend, you have to start using those tools and those techniques and think about the content you create and how to make it functional for learning, not being overly cluttered, maybe leveraging something like Mayer's principles of multimedia design to think about, what's the right mix of text and graphics and a talking head if you're going to do that. So it lends itself very readily to moving towards going fully online. I remember when I was thinking about that question, it struck me again, this idea of looking at it the other way around, because in online, and I've taught online in two very different kinds of environments, one being teachers who were paying for their own professional development, and it was a very rewarding experience. And I did that for years in these 4-week flipped classroom workshops I ran. And then I've taught in the
Mm.
traditional online environment here at the school, and that's been frustrating because of the lack of engagement. It's really hard to get students to, they sort of want to be able to just be removed and just use discussion forums and email. But a good friend of mine who's a doctor, I don't know if her doctorate is specifically in linguistics, but she's an expert in linguistics, and she often participates in these sessions. Dr. Helene Marshall
Nice.
reminded me recently in a discussion that if I remember correctly, that 60% of communication is nonverbal. So think about how much that's missing from the online environment. So I think when I think about blended, I think a huge opportunity is bringing face-to-face techniques into the online environment. And one approach that I like to recommend is asynchronous video chat tools. So a Flipgrid or their voice thread was a big one too. They started charging. Of course, these folks have to charge after a while to sustain. But with an asynchronous video conversation, now you can have that kind of face-to-face, but you're not inconveniencing the person in the online class who wants to be able to do things on their own time. They can record their video response when they want. So I'm a big fan of that idea. And when I think about blended, again, there's this part that strikes me that is not part of the normal blended conversation that says bring the face-to-face stuff into online, not just the other way around.
That's brilliant. I've got a question about one point of that. And Tara, if you could bring up George Station, if the camera is working and the broadband is working. Kelly, do you think, why asynchronous video as opposed to, well, what we're doing now, synchronous video?
I say that large, and hi George. I say that largely because of the expectation in the normal online classroom that I'm going to do this when it's convenient to me. Now that doesn't mean you can't have synchronous. In fact, Dr. Marshall, whom I mentioned, created an approach she calls SOFLO, or synchronous online flipped learning, and she very purposely has the students in the graduate courses she teach, knowing that they're going to go into this online class and have to meet at a given time each week for them to have that interaction. And I think that's awesome if you can get students to do it.
Oh, that's really smart. Oh, thank you. Maybe we'll come back to that. That's a really neat one. George Station, so glad to see you. Where are you today?
I am in Monterey. I'm going to be on campus in about an hour and a half teaching a first year class, but I wanted to make time to say hi to Kelly here and ask a couple of really, really easy questions and non-challenging things.
Great.
Don't believe it. He's setting you up.
It's a total setup. But just to add to maybe if we can get back to synchronous later. Okay, so already this week with my face-to-face first year class, I did an online Google Hangout with the Digital Pedagogy Lab people who are meeting right now at UMW, right? So I'm going to say there's a conversation to be had about synchronous interaction, and I think that was a blended, I would put that on the list of possible blended experiences because frankly, we just did it the other day. So we can come back to that one, but I wanted to get that in. So that's not my real question, though, because I think you're talking about the social aspects and bring that in, and I think we're kind of on the same page with all that. I'm wondering about maybe this is a CIO hat, but there's some top-down type issues that kind of butt up against the classroom issues with consideration of blended and so on, because I think there's a challenge because chairs, deans, and so on can see this as a scheduling advantage. It's about, hey, we can free up some classroom space. We can put our classes, call them hybrid, half in the room, classroom, half online, whatever. And they're not getting the pedagogical advantages of blended. It's more about scheduling. And I'm wondering if you could address that challenge that maybe isn't at your institution because you're there, but it can be a challenge elsewhere. And I think the other one that is maybe not related, it's more at the classroom end, but I'll just get both questions out there. Have you seen anything by way of pushback because of those anti-laptop, anti-BOD studies that keep coming out that say, we don't really need the technology. We need to have our students face-to-face and get the technology out of the classroom and so on. So they're not unrelated, but yeah, two different things here.
Right. So yeah, in terms of and now you're right. You got my brain spinning on that second question, and I'm almost forgetting the first one. So pushback. It's the first question again.
Okay, so the first one is just about like the kind of top-down pressure. That's right. About scheduling and not about pedagogy and what the students are actually doing as far as teaching and learning and so on. Right.
Yeah. No. I think that would be a real mistake to happen on a large scale level. This is not about the conveniences of class time and trying to save space and trying to use resources. I don't want to say not using resources more efficiently, but this is not about saving money. This is purely about pedagogy. There can be, that being said, there can be opportunities, and we purposely changed our evening model about 4 years ago because we had students coming here twice a week, and it's very challenging for adult working students to do that. And we said, you know what? Our concern was if we made it once a week, it's going to be a super long, about a 4.25 hour night. And then we realized let's go a little hybrid. All right. So let's take some of that time and build that into rich interactive content within the course that they can do outside of the classroom. And I think it was a win-win all around. It really worked. It was what was driving it was the right thing for the students, and it didn't create a negative experience from a pedagogical perspective. In fact, it had certain advantages that come with blended, that that content that they can get to anytime. We have to put it in the class. It's not a matter of faculty can decide whether or not they want to make it available. We had to have a decent build out of the class content. So I think that really won. But I agree, there's definitely that unfortunate potential that from an administrative perspective, someone might jump on this and kind of approach it from the wrong angle. And as far as pushback because of the laptops, and my observation is that so many of the stories that have happened around large-scale wastes of, there's a couple angles to that. So one is school districts or institutions spend a lot of money on technology, and they do some measurements, and it goes nowhere fast. But meanwhile, where was the professional development? Where was the overall plan in the first place to how this was going to be implemented and what was going to be measured? So there's a lot of those stories that give the idea of technology and education a black eye. And then at the more immediate level for faculty, it's easy to say, hey, you know what, they bring in these gadgets and they're distracted and they're looking at their phone. Well, there's a couple of considerations. One is, how engaging is what you're doing? Do you have them actively involved in leveraging those tools from time to time? Are you walking around the classroom and paying attention to what they're doing? Now, I know that's challenging in a large lecture hall, but that again kind of goes to that. Well, how engaging is what's happening in the content in the course of your lecture? So there's always going to be those pushback people, and they certainly, sometimes there's some valid points, but there's almost always a way to think about how to approach that more constructively.
Okay, great. Thank you. And I guess, related to that, what's your thought these days on how faculty can decide what's best in that face-to-face environment and what's best in the online environment? I think some years ago, it was truly a constant consideration in the, I'm going to say, early days of blended 10 years ago, even though that wasn't that early. But when people started using that word a lot. And I'm wondering what your thinking is these days on how faculty can best approach making that decision as far as what stays face-to-face, what's okay to go to that other side of online, and, if they're in a primarily face-to-face environment in the first place.
Sure. Well, I'll answer that again kind of in two parts. If we're just kind of thinking blended and not getting specific, because when I hear that question, I really start thinking about flipped learning. But if we're just talking kind of blended without necessarily being that model, my first thought is make available resources that can help students reinforce their learnings, things that either provide an additional look at a topic, perhaps some of your own content, and again, there I'm thinking kind of flipped, if you're creating your own materials for the students to be able to access. And again, the part of the beauty of blending is creating content that they can get to anytime, anywhere, and rewind and rewatch, and not be so dependent upon having to just sit and focus on, I've got to get the notes right while they're talking up there, and I'm so focused on that that I may not even really be necessarily hearing it well. Although not to say there isn't a huge value to note taking, because there is. But here's a great example of blended. Give them a recorded, and content needs to be short. So maybe they've got a couple little 10-minute, 2 10-minute lectures to introduce a topic. Have them write notes and hand them in. Now you've combined, now you've blended the best of both worlds, and they can go back to that content anytime they want, but they're using techniques that we know work well in the traditional classroom. So I get off talking on those tangents, and I almost forget where we started.
Great.
Anyway, so hopefully those ideas help, but obviously I love
this actually, it is. Thank you very much, Kelly. That's great. Brian, thanks for bringing me up on stage. I'm going to stay in the chat, but I'm going to kind of bail to keep prepping for my class that starts in about an hour and a half here.
Well,
take care.
Class
Great,
well.
George.
Hey, this is what we do. Thanks.
Thank you, George. Well, friends, we're going to do an experiment here. We're going to go back to our practice of what we call mingle sessions. And what that means is I'm going to give you all a question to think about. And what I want you to do is pair up or get in groups of 3 or even 4 or even 5, if you can, with other people here, and then talk about this question. And so the question I'd like to ask is, how can you grow blended learning where you are? If you're at a library, if you're at a college, if you're at a university, if you're at a state government, if you're a trustee, if you're a president, if you're a faculty member, if you're a technologist, how can you grow this? And please be critical. Please be skeptical. Say, this might not work for us, depending on who we are. But think about that. Think about the different patterns that we've just been discussing. Think about the different features, the different practical ways of doing this. And let's take 5 minutes and do this. So Kelly and I are going to literally climb off the stage. We're going to mingle with you all. So grab a partner or two partners, and then let's talk for 5 minutes. Be ready to see what you discovered and to talk about it. We'll see you in 5 minutes. Well, welcome back, friends. Welcome back from our mingle session, where we went off on our own into small groups and hashed out some of these ideas. It's a video conference equivalent of what we do in large classes or even medium-sized classes when we break into groups to have conversations. I had a great conversation just now talking with two folks from the University of California system, and they had some really, really interesting insights. One of them was that because they have a system structure, the system is able to help and support people, but also that they said they do a lot of what Kelly described, of having professional development, of having educational technology support this, and it seemed that this is a growing movement. Kelly, what did you find in your conversations?
I had a conversation with Vanessa, and we talked briefly about labels and about what these things are called. So she was mentioning that she was doing things along these lines back in the '90s, in the dawn of the internet, and so it was called computer-assisted learning, and it's so true. I find it a little frustrating from time to time how people will get lost in labels and definitions as opposed to just focusing on what can we do to improve pedagogy. And then I was starting a brief conversation, and Michael was mentioning about creating libraries of resources for faculty to use for blended learning purposes. So some interesting ideas. I actually struggle with the technology a little bit too, because it seems like you used to drag and drop the pictures to connect, and now it's like you click in the picture to connect.
Yeah.
So that threw me a little.
Double click helps too. I do that. And anybody else who wanted to share a thought that came up in their mingling, either type it into the chat box, or if you look on the screen, there's two join podium icons right now. So kind of teal colored boxes. So if you click them, up we go with video. So if you want to share something that came up in that moment, please do. We have a question that came up in the chat box. I want to put this up because it came from the awesome Sonia Stroll. Sonia asked, when developing a blended class, what strategies do you recommend for instances when a student misses a face-to-face session? How can you recreate that face-to-face experience for those students when the moment has passed? Subtle question, Sonia.
I can't help but think of the flipped classroom and part of why it evolved in the first place. So Aaron Sams and John Bergman, who are commonly considered two of the big pioneers of that movement, one of the main reasons they started going in this direction is because they had a lot of, they were both teaching high school chemistry and had a lot of students involved in extracurricular activities and sports, and they would miss classes. It was one of the very reasons that they began to blend or flip. They started capturing their learning content in short videos so that those students who missed class would not miss the delivery of learning content. And I'd be lying if I didn't say, my perspective on blended is much more focused on flipped than anything else when it comes to the traditional classroom. By flipping the traditional classroom, we allow students who are going to miss to not have to miss the delivery content. And I know the phrase is a little hackneyed, but this idea of you don't have to be the sage on stage anymore, you can be the guide on the side. So when you create that, your content as small snips of digital content that can be rewound and replayed, now you've changed the nature of your class, and in class you can focus on how do we figure out what they're struggling with, how to apply it, how to fill those gaps in knowledge, how to personalize it so it works for each student, and that sort of thing. So and I apologize because I kind of flipped your question and didn't really answer it directly, but part of that goes back to the design of the blended or flipped learning courses and content to start with.
Well, thank you for the answer. And Sonia, that's a really good question. If you want to follow up on chat or on video, please do. Yep. We have another question that came from a great friend of the forum, from Maria Anderson, who couldn't make it today, but did want to ask a question, which was, how can you ensure that blended learning is the best of both worlds and not the worst of both worlds?
Again, real good question. It comes down to taking the time to learn and slowly. That's another thing that's really important. I think when teachers are going to start trying these techniques, leverage resources to learn and start small and iterate. So, create small bits of content or curate bits of content. Try it around a specific topic or time frame, and learn as you go as you're doing this, and find what doesn't work and stop doing it and fix it. Find what does work and elaborate on that. So I think that's really important. Leverage the many resources that are available out there to learn more about this. Learn from others who have experienced this.
Okay.
One of the great things about the internet and the web is that people are sharing all the time their good practices, and many teachers who are passionate about what they do have written about it. So learn from those things, ease into it, and gradually improve upon what you do. I think that's really the key to doing this and doing it well.
Oh, great. Well, speaking of Maria, she just appeared. I'm so glad you can make it. Hello, Maria.
Hey, yeah, I'm here. So, one of the reasons I asked this question is I used to teach some blended classes, and what I discovered was, I would say hybrid classes, right? So they were half online, half face-to-face, right? And what I discovered early on, and this was maybe, 7 or 8 years ago, so maybe it's just gotten better over time, was that somehow I ended up with the students who wished they had been able to take a fully online class, and they were full, so they were in the hybrid class, and they were grouchy about coming to school. And the students who wished they'd had a full, face-to-face, no online class, and they couldn't get into any of those, so they were in a hybrid class. And so that's what I meant by how do you make sure it's the best of both worlds, and not because those students were all universally unhappy. Everybody wanted a different format than what they had.
Yeah.
So
you were in the wrong time at the wrong place.
It was just everything else was full, and I ended up here, right?
Yeah.
It's not the kinds of students you want. They're all hostages to a format they didn't want.
Ooh.
Yeah, that's. I don't think that's about the pedagogy. That's just about the circumstances, and that can happen today. Like you said, because time has gone by, I think more and more students are more comfortable with and willing to accept the idea of more digital content. But it's really hard to fight that sort of the expectations or the requirements if they really need to be online, and suddenly they're half the time they have to show up in class. It can be a real challenge and an inconvenience. So I don't think there's a real good way to kind of fight that.
I think just communication, maybe, clear communication and catalogs and signing up for classes that, we
like to call it managing expectations.
Yeah, managing expectations, exactly.
That's a key to life, actually. Managing expectation.
Yep.
Speaking of life, we have Luz Miranda. Luz, I can't see your video, and I don't think I can hear your sound. I think you're muted. So if you want to try and turn your camera on and turn your mic on, we can hear from one of you. We can hear or see you, I mean. Okay, so Tara's working on that. Well, while Luz and Tara are working on that, I've got one last question for you. This is, Kelly, this is the future transform, and we're looking at the future of where this could go. And you've been fantastic at showing us how this actually works in practice. We're really grateful for that. Thinking a little bit ahead, and I'm thinking about, though, a comment from Wendy Brenter. She was talking about blended learning as a gateway drug, or gateway to fully online faculty teaching. Do you think maybe if, say, 5 years from now, if the majority of teaching is done wholly online, it's quite possible it could happen, will we see blended learning as a kind of transition stage along the way? Or do you think blended learning will carve out its own space as distinct from distance learning?
I think the future of learning, particularly in higher ed, and then to a lesser degree as you look at high school and middle school, is blended. I think that's just inevitably the way it would go. The idea of going to just, like you said, 5 years from now, maybe a huge, I don't know if you said exclusively online, that terrifies me. I think we have to have, it's one of the reasons I like the phrase blended learning. I think we have to have personal interaction in any kind of course to make it the most rewarding. As you know, online retention levels in online are terrible. And I can't help but believe that one part of that is there's just this lack of human connection. And I'll also just kind of throw in there that I do believe, because this comes up every now and then when we're talking about very young grades, elementary grades or primary, as they call it outside of the U.S., need to be wholly, very little online. I mean, we can do a little of it to introduce it. And speaking of blended, I mean, all classes ought to have some kind of online web page with some kind of information. So when students do have to miss class, they have an idea what to do. So I think the future of learning is going to be increasingly blended, and I think that's fine as long as we shepherd that along carefully. But anyway, hope that answers your question.
It does. It shows your passion for this. It shows your knowledge, and I think that's a really positive vision. We'll have to think about this.
Lose?
I'm afraid we did. And we're going to have to lose the whole session because we're done. We've gone past an hour. And this is entirely thanks to you, Kelly, with your energy, your enthusiasm, your information, your kindness in answering people. And it's thanks to you, my friends in the Future Transformed, for asking questions and thinking hard about this. We're so grateful you could make it. We're thankful for your time.
Absolutely. Thank you, Brian.
Well, we'll follow up and keep up the great work.
All right, great. And thanks, everybody. It was a lot of fun. Take care.
Excellent. Now, don't everyone go yet because we have to tell you about next week and what we're up to. So here is the last update as to where things stand. So first of all, next week, we're going to dive into a specific new education technology. This is the HACS project from Brian Ollendijk at Penn State. Now, Penn State is the home of some crazy inventors, some wild innovators, definitely a great hive of activity. We've had a few guests from there before, and Brian is no exception. His HACS project is an incredibly ambitious way of doing a new kind of web authoring. I'm really, really looking forward to this. We'll share links to his work, but please come next week and be ready to explore HACS. Now, also next week, over the next slide, please, Tara. Our book club is continuing. We're about halfway through New York 2140, and the discussion is furious. People are all over the place. Comments are flowing. People are writing blog posts. Twitter is lighting up. Comments on Facebook. The book has really triggered a lot of thoughts and questions. It's a really engaging book, very ambitious, lots of stuff going on. Please dive in. Check the blog, and you can follow up. If you need a copy of this, or if you need a copy of any of the books that we've discussed in the 2.5 years, The Future Transformed, check out our bookstore, where we've got a whole curated list, probably unique list in the world, of titles on the future of education and technology. And then, Tara, let's go over to the social slide. If you want to keep up with us, if you want to keep up with where things are, we have the hashtag FTTE, we have our Slack channel, we have our LinkedIn group, we have our Facebook group, and some of the questions for today came from those groups. So we're grateful to everybody who did that. Well, in the meantime, keep the conversation going, and let's see you next week. Take care. Bye-bye.